Hi everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to use Photoshop Elements to create a very simple infographic. An infographic is a great introductory assignment for us here. And the instructional design context behind this particular document that I've created as a model is really simple. I'm going to be a biology teacher here, and let's say we're doing a module on predators. And I want my students in this case to actually be the ones who create the infographic as a way to demonstrate their mastery of some particular subject. So in my head here, they each get to choose a particular predator, they do the research, and they find some very simple statistics. So probably a target learner level here in elementary, early middle, something like that. Anyway, so take a look at the number of elements that I have in this particular design. You can see I've obviously got a big photo, a main photo. Then I've got a couple shape elements, there's a gradient, and then several text elements. It does not take very much to make a good infographic. So I want to keep this simple, and I want to encourage you to keep your designs simple for your assignment. Don't bite off more than you can chew for this first assignment. Just a few elements is all we need. So how do we start? Well, I guess the first thing I should remind you to do is to make sure you're in expert mode. And then, of course, you'll probably start a new file. It may pop up automatically as soon as you open Photoshop Elements, but I'm going to go ahead and start a blank file. And there are a few decisions that you have to make in here. Obviously, one of them is to give it a name, and so I'm going to just call this White Shark. And from there, you have to choose some sizing issues. I'd go ahead and set your dimensions to pixels here. They have other units that you can choose. In general, I try to develop for 16 by 9 frames, primarily because that's what most of my monitors use, and it's what most of my web designs and other content, especially video, are designed to fit inside this 16 by 9, which is the minimum HD resolution. But it could be much smaller than that, depending on what it is that we're trying to create. But in this case, for this particular design, this is going to be something that we're going to project to the students full screen. We might integrate it in some of our learning management system documents. I might post it on my Weebly site, for example, or I might have them submit it as a particular file in our Moodle learning management system. Just depends. But in my head here, this is a web delivered document. So with that in mind, since I know it's going to be a digital document, digital delivery, I need to set my resolution to 72 pixels per inch. If I were printing this, 300 pixels per inch would probably be a good measure, or if I knew I had a real high quality printer, I could even boost that up to 600. But for most of us, because the math gets really complicated later on, for most of us when we're designing for the screen, just keep it simple. Keep it at 72 and just remember that number. So anyway, I'm going to start off at 1280 by 720, and as you'll see, when I crop and move stuff around, this is going to change a little bit. But these are just some good settings to begin with. The background contents, I'm going to go ahead and leave those white, and I do that deliberately because sometimes it's easier just to design on a white background. I can always change it later and make it transparent, but right now, if I keep it on white, it's easier to see small elements, because if I were to pull this down and set this to transparent, the background of that particular file would be checkered, and it's just hard to see some things on there. The color model that I'm going to use here is red, green, and blue, so I'm going to keep that there just to keep things simple, and then I'll click OK. And you probably saw for a second there, it blinked on that checkerboard. That's what I was talking about. If it were transparent, that's what you would see, and it just makes it hard to get everything lined up appropriately, because you can barely see the edges sometimes because they blend into each other. Anyway, here we go. So why don't I start off by pointing out a couple things here in the interface first before we start cluttering it with objects. On the right hand side, I have my layers palette, and currently the only layer I have in here is the background. And Photoshop obviously is built in multiple layers, and that's one of the most powerful parts of this application, as we'll shortly see. If you don't see the layers up by default, you may want to drop down here to the bottom and click on the layers button. There are many other things here as well, and we'll learn a lot more about these as we pursue other modules. But for right now, just click on the layers button. Over here on the left hand side, we have a variety of different tools. We're certainly not going to use all of them today. But throughout the rest of this course, we'll covered just about every one of them. So let's start at the beginning then. I need an image. I found that image of that shark. I searched Google. I found a royalty-free image that I can use, and I'm ready to put it in here. So what do? Well, I'm just going to copy it from Google, and then I'm going to paste it in here. And as it turns out, the image that I copied is the same resolution as my target resolutions, 1280 by 720. Now that rarely happens, and even though it matches up nicely here, I don't like the framing of this photo, and so I'm going to change that right now. And the first thing I'm going to do is to crop the image. So I'll come down here to the left-hand side and click the crop button. And within the crop button, I'm going to move that down just a little bit. All I did was push that menu down. You can see that now I've got these handles here that will allow me to move this around to whatever dimensions I want. And I want to get this guy framed up something like that. So he's somewhere in the third here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this, shove it over just a little bit, get him so he's framed pretty well, something like that, and close off the right edge here just a little bit. So he's close to that right-hand third. That looks pretty good to me, and so I'll click the check box down here, and now I have this nicely framed. Now, of course, you see I've got some extra content over here on the left side. What do I want to do? Well, if I want to, I can just get rid of that. I can lasso that and then double click and it's gone. Or let me Control Z that. An alternative, and this is not usually recommended, but with just a few dimensions, sometimes you can get away with just stretching it back out and nobody really notices, that the shark is suddenly distorted a little bit wider than he was. Not a big deal for tiny modifications, but for others, it may not be something that you want to do. So my next step is to import some shapes here. Actually, one of them I'm going to draw and the other one I'm going to import. So your shapes tool is over here on the left-hand side, and it might be a rectangle. It could be a circle. In this case, it's this little funky starfish thing, and that's the custom shapes tool. I'm not actually going to drag a custom or draw a custom shape here, but if I selected it and I come over here to this pull down menu, you can, and then choose this pull down menu, you can see there's a giant library of different shapes here. And that can be very practical when you're trying to find just the right shape, but I'm going to keep it super simple, and I recommend that you do too. And I'm going to draw a rectangle here that goes across the screen, something like this. So I just get that seal in there, that lucky seal that got away. So now I have this frame drawn, and my next step, of course, is to fill it with some color. So I'm going to pick some color here, and I'm going to start off with just white. And the hexadecimal code for white is FFFFFF, or I could just click my mouse up here in the corner and drive myself crazy until I got it just perfectly up there in the top left-hand corner. Click OK, and now here's my color palette. White's ready, but I need a paint bucket. So I'm going to grab my paint bucket and fill this with white color. How come I can't see it? Well, if I look over here in my Layers tab now, I have two new layers. I have the shark layer, and then I have this shape layer that I just drew. If I simply drag that shape layer up, now I can see it. So one of the most important things you need to notice about layers is that we move them around in the layers palette over here. It's not like in PowerPoint where you right click and say send back, etc. In Photoshop, we can have very long vertical or very tall vertical arrangements here of complex layering schemas. And that's very, very helpful for what we want to do. So make sure your shape is on top of the photo. The second image that I got is this shark fin. And instead of copying and pasting it directly into Photoshop like I did the shark, in this case, I actually had to do a slightly different process. And I want to explain that to you just in case this applies to you. Now you might notice that this is a drawn shape. It's not a photo. In fact, it's a PNG file, a PNG, a portable network graphics file. And what makes that significant is that portable network graphics files can support alpha transparency. And what that means is that we can make the background invisible. You'll notice that there's no frame around this. We can see the dotted lines, but there's no color, background color assigned to that. And that's fantastic, because it allows us to take just the shape itself and layer it directly over the other elements that we want it to cover. So in my head, what I'm seeing here is this shape, and I'm going to stretch it out here just a little bit so that it carries a little more weight. Make it a little bit taller. There we go. Maybe just a little bit wider on this side coming back. I don't want it to be too dominant. That might be a little bit too much, so I'll bring it back down there. Something like this. So I want it to be sizable compared to this, but if you're paying attention here, let me deselect here, or I'll click the checkbox here. But if you're paying attention here, you should notice that, wow, we have a lot of strong elements in this particular design. They're competing against each other right now. And we know that Robin Williams loves the principle of contrast, but the elements are kind of fighting each other right now. And so we're going to fix that here in just a second. One of the simplest ways that we can do that is to take a shape and add some opacity to it. So I'm going to click on my rectangle and notice that up here in my layers, the shape automatically highlights to let me know that it's active. And notice it says shape 1 by default. I'm going to double click and change that now, and I'm just going to call it rectangle. That will help me keep track of it later on. I hit the enter button. And layer 1, I should probably call that shark, but I can see that it's a shark, and shark fin up there, I can see that. I might shorten that actually just because there's so much stuff in there. I'll just call it shark fin. Okay. So again, back to the point here, we want to reduce some of the competition here between these elements. So I've got this really dominant shark here, but it's being smothered by this rectangle. How can we reduce the weight of this particular rectangle? It's very easy. All I have to do is select the rectangle here, in this case the white rectangle, and you can see that it's highlighted up here in the layers palette, and reduce its opacity. So I'll drop it down to about 70%, something like that. That looks pretty good. Now suddenly the shark can be seen through the actual rectangle, and because we've diminished the weight value, the intensity, the dominance of that rectangle. And of course that's all deliberate. That helps set up what we're going to do next, which is to put some text on here. Adding text is really easy. There's a text tool, and you simply click up there in the design and then type the text that you want. So obviously I'm going to type in here great white. And notice if I hit the enter button and type in great white, I've got so much space right here. That's just not very practical for what I want to do. Photoshop Elements is great at many things, but it doesn't allow us to control kerning and leading very well at all. And so a better solution, let me go ahead and delete that. I'll backspace up here. A better solution is to type one word just the way you want it. I'm going to leave it right there just like that. Now I've cheated, okay? When you double click it, or when you activate the text tool, or when you double click any text object, you get the typical font menu down here. And you can spend hours looking at all these different fonts that are available. It will drive you crazy, but eventually you'll find one that speaks to you. And remember what we learned earlier, in most cases for screen productions or digital productions that are not designed to be printed, you want to use a sans serif font so that it doesn't have those little squigglies down here at the end of each letter. That just makes it harder to read. So sans serif is what you want, not a serif font. But the other tip that I want to suggest here to deal with kerning and leading, etc., is to take one layer of one word. If you know that you have dominant title text and you want to get precise positioning control of them, instead of hitting the enter button here after great and getting white down there on the second line with too much space in between them, it's much easier, I think, to just create one word exactly the way you want it, and then go back into your layers palette and right-click the layer and duplicate it. And then you'll get another copy of great, and you can then double-click that after you move it and type shark. And after you click the checkbox, now you can position this precisely. And so the look that and I guess I forgot the word white, but you know what I'm talking about. I'll clean this up in a second. But one thing I want to point out here, what this affords us to do is to repeat some of the organic other elements in the design. For example, do you see this angle here of the shark jumping backwards? That's a cool straight line, very dominant here. I can sort of simulate that by lining up these text elements so that they complement that particular angle. Okay, it's a very subtle way to use Williams' principle of repetition here to add some meaning to this particular document. What is it also doing? Well, this angle is kind of throwing the eye back this direction, and so we want to take advantage of that and put most of our content, in this design anyway, on the left-hand side. So give me a second here. Let me get this text cleaned up. Okay, you can see what I've done now. I've kind of tweaked some things around. I've got my title text here positioned exactly where I want it. I resized the fin exactly where I want it, and I shrunk the white rectangle here just a little bit. And I also added this text here. And notice that the bottom baseline of this text here lines up with this white rectangle. That's not by coincidence. Remember the principle of alignment with Robin Williams. Everything is connected on the page. And that's a very subtle way that we can do that. And there's some other cool things that we did with the text here as well. Notice how the text follows this curved shape here of the fin. It reinforces it on this side, and it reinforces it on the right-hand side as well. What does that do? Well, it helps promote document unity. And that's one of those concepts that Robin Williams talked a lot about in our readings. Anyway, here's something really cool. This gray color here, it's all right. It works well enough. It does, after all, look somewhat like the grayish color that's in the color of the shark skin here. But as we studied in the module for this week, when you have a dominant color scheme that's primarily primary colors, you can create another color that can contrast against that. And one of the strongest contrasts that you'll get is to use another primary color. And we've also studied before this notion of organic color, especially when you're using photos. Now, I don't have a whole lot to choose from here. Where am I going with this? Well, my point is PNG colors or PNG files, you can actually change the colors of those. That's what's really, really cool about doing this in Photoshop. It can be as simple as going to as choosing a color. Let's say I'll pick this red here, and then grabbing the paint bucket and pouring it. Whoops, I have to select the letter. Sorry about that. I have to select the layer. So let's choose the appropriate shark fin layer and then paint the bucket in there. But if you'll notice what happened, well, the paint just filled it up all the way to the edges, and I lost all the contours in that shape. That's not entirely desirable, and there is a much better way. Here's how we do this. This is so neat. With the image selected, I have to grab my selection tool here and click on the actual shark fin, and I go up to the Enhance menu, down to Adjust Color, Adjust Hue and Saturation. Now, this is a grayscale image. If I grab these sliders here and move them around, nothing happens to that gray. It stays gray. Well, Photoshop has a really cool feature here called Colorize. If I click on Colorize, suddenly it throws some color in there, and from there I can move this around until I get just the right tint or hue that I want. If I want it green, I want it blue, purple, etc. I can get any color I want. Well, what color do I want? Well, I'm going for something real subtle, organic here. I'm going to choose this reddish, rusty color that looks a lot like that gum line there by the shark. Very, very subtle. Now, if I wanted to do blue, I think blue would look pretty good as well, pretty organic. But the blue doesn't really contrast much against the ocean. Let me move this out of the way so you can see it a little bit better. It actually looks pretty cool. It looks very, very unified. But remember, this is an instructional graphic. I'm trying to teach my students something, or more literally in this case, in this design, they're trying to teach each other information about their particular predator animal that they selected. So with that in mind, it might make more sense to have this color contrast more against the background, against this rectangle, and to compete a little bit with the shark. And so one way to do that is to find another color in there that adds a little bit more contrast. So I'm going to choose that, maybe go a little bit more in the red zone here. Something like that. There we go. That looks pretty good. That might be too much red. And then I'll drop the intensity just a little bit here. There we go. So now we're kind of duplicating some of that gum line there. Very organic design. Let me close this out. And it does pop out from the rest of the elements that are on this particular design. One more cool thing that I've done here with this shark fin, if you were really observant, you might have noticed that this shadow appeared here suddenly. Let me show you how I made that. It's really easy, but it can add another level of contrast this, again, to help it pop off the rest of the background. So here's how that's done. I have to select the image first, or select the layer, okay, and you'll see that I've got it selected up here as well. And then I'll go up here to the layer menu, and I'll choose the layer style option, style settings, and I'll click on this box here called drop shadow. When I click on that, it gives me a default shadow, and then I can go up here and I can play around with some of the parameters. I can change the direction of the light. So I'm going to choose something like that. That'll work pretty well. And I can change the size of the shadow and the distance. You can maneuver this around until you find what looks appropriate for you. So I'm going to cancel that because I've already got set up exactly the way I want. But a real neat subtle effect and a good way to make any element pop off whatever's behind it. Finally, let's talk about contrast. Take a look at my title text here. It's white. White is a very powerful color against darker backgrounds. But I don't think this blue is dark enough, and the photo in general just kind of dominates this design. So I want to add a black background behind that, or a dark background behind that. And I want it to cover about a third of this design here. I want it to look something like this. Okay, now what's different about this from the other shapes that we've used? Well, you probably can see right here that even though it is a rectangle, it's got a gradient color scheme that starts with transparent color, meaning no color, and then gradually fades to black. And I want to show you how that's done. I think it's probably the hardest part in this entire module. It's easy, of course, to create any old rectangle. Here, let me turn that off. Now we could easily grab a shape tool here and drag out a black rectangle and flip the color around, grab the paint bucket tool and paint it black. Of course, I would have to shove this up all the way to the top so I can see it. Oh no, I need to move it down to get it under the text and keep going under the text, and there we go. So I could make this happen, but that hard edge just doesn't look very good. So I'm going to turn that off. And I want a design that works a little bit more subtly. I want it to look like this. I want to still see some of the photo here and then kind of gradually fade that out into this darker background here. Because again, what does that do? This adds more weight to the left side of the page. And what does that do? That grabs the eyeball. Remember, the whole point here is to teach our students something about the predators that they have each selected. And so we can direct the eye movement by adding more weight to the side of the page that has the most important information. Obviously, the shark in this case is an awesome photo and it does grab their attention, but we don't want to create this split attention effect. We want to get the eye where it needs to be. And so Mayer would be pleased that we're trying to move the eyeball in the left-hand direction here so that they can focus on the information that's important. So how do we create this gradient? The first step is to create a new layer, and that's easily done. Up here in the top right-hand corner, there's a pull-down menu, and I can choose New Layer, or I can hit Shift-Control-N. It'll pop up with a dialog here, and of course I'll just say, oh, I don't know, I'll call it Black Gradient. Black Gradient. All right, and so it's empty right now. Just ignore the one below it here. I've got that one blocked out here. See, if I turn the eyeball on or off, I can make it disappear. So let me show you how we can duplicate that. So it's empty right now. This is my layer. I have to obviously make sure it's in the right position. And it is, because it has to go under the text, under the shark fin, and under this text as well. It's also going to go under the white rectangle. So here it is. You can see the rest of my layer stack, and so it's in the proper position. That's the first thing we check. Now, how do we actually draw it? Well, we have a gradient tool over here on our drawing menu, and when I click it, it selects, or it pops up a context sensitive menu down here. And if I click on this pull down menu under gradient, it shows me some different gradient options that I have here by default. And one of them is this foreground to transparent option. So that's the one that I'll select. And you can see it now. It's selected down here, but it may not be completely edited the way I want it to look. And so that brings me to the gradient editor here. And this is where it gets a little tricky. You have two sets of sliders here, two on the bottom, one at each end, and two on the top, one at each end. The ones on the bottom are your actual colors. So in this case, if I click on the bottom rectangle here, I can choose this pull down menu and choose the appropriate color that I want. I can scroll through here, or I can click on the color wheel and find the exact shade of the color that I want, and I'll select it. Maybe I'll choose something a little bit darker or a little less dark. So I clicked on this one, I chose the color. This is what I want the gradient to end up being. On the right hand side, I have the initial, what they call a color stop. And in this case, there's absolutely no color in it. So I'm going to leave that exactly where it is. These top sliders determine intensity. And one way to think of intensity is to think about where you want the black in this case to be solid. Up until every point to the right of where my mouse is right now, and there's a little bit of transparency still applied. Everywhere to the left is 100%. So I have to know in my head how wide a solid space I need to go behind the text that I want. So I know it's going to be somewhere around 50%, something like that. So I'm going to choose 50%. And I'm going to leave this one over here. I want the gradient to fade gradually. If I wanted it to be real abrupt, I could shove it over to the left a little bit and keep those real close together, and you can see it almost becomes a straight line. And for this design, that kind of defeats the purpose, what's in my head. So let me drag that back over. So I'll click OK. And what's happened? Well, nothing. All I've done is define my color parameters. And you'll notice that down here in the gradient preview, it's a little bit wider than what it was before. I have to be careful which direction I drag. If I drag from left to right, it's going to fill the whole page. So I'm going to undo that. If I drag from right to left, it will only color up to the actual border. Why is that so? Well, because I stopped the gradient right at the edge of the actual frame, and I started it with only a third left. So the gradient is going to go all the way across the document past the point where you release the mouse, unless it hits the border of the document. And in this case, that's exactly what I wanted to do. All I'm trying to do here is to add some additional contrast to this title element, as well as to, again, help this shark fin pop off the back of the screen. So this looks really good now. I've got a sufficient level of contrast here for my title. The shark fin pops, and yet I can still see the image over here on the right-hand side. So of course, my final step in this entire process is to save. If I were to simply go to the File menu here and select Save, what's going to happen? Well, Photoshop is going to recognize that I'm creating a composition here. I've got a project that has lots of different elements in it, and by default, it's going to want to save it as a Photoshop document. And this is your project file, and it's an excellent idea to save your project file pretty much every time you pause during the editing process. I didn't do it during this recording just because it's cumbersome, but when you're developing for real, just like when you're writing a paper, you want to save every pause. And the correct file format to save it is a Photoshop document. That is the native Photoshop file .psd format. But in addition to saving it as the project PSD file, I also have to save a version or export a version in a file format that's actually usable for whatever my end destination is. And in this case, I want to put it on the web. I want to put it in our learning management system, or maybe I want to put it on our class blog. Maybe I want to put it up on our class Weebly site, whatever. If it's going on the internet, I can't stick it up here as a Photoshop document because only people with Photoshop will be able to open it. So what's a better choice? Well, if I go to the File menu and select Save for Web, it'll give me a few options here under this pull-down menu: GIF, JPEG, and PNG. PNGs are portable network graphics, like we said earlier before. They're primarily used, or I guess most valuable, for certain interface elements and navigation elements in complex designs where you can take advantage of this alpha channel. Especially if you want the mouse, when the user hovers over the button, you want it to change states. You want it to be a different color or to lose opacity when they mouse over it and maybe reveal something underneath it. That's where PNGs are really, really valuable. But for our needs here, we're going to use JPEG because this is primarily a photo. So we have a lot of visual content here that's represented as a photo. JPEGs provide excellent quality and excellent compression. So I'll choose JPEG, and under the next pull down menu I have some options here, and most of the time we're going to save this at least as very high. I'm typically going to put something in the 70 and 80 range, especially since everybody's got broadband internet right now. We don't have to try to squish this down too small. So JPEG, very high quality. You can play around with that to see the differences. For example, if I were to set it way down low here, you can see that it starts to pixelate. It doesn't look quite as good. If I put it up to 100, it will also show you what the default size is. You can see originally we were 1.78 megs, and the maximum quality, it'll squish it down to 466. If I drop it down to 20, it becomes 67K. So you can see what the math does here, but as a rule of thumb, I'm usually in the 80 range, something like that. And then simply click Save, and you'll have a JPEG that you can then upload to the web, to your learning management system, your blog, or whatever that destination is. So that's it. That's how we create a simple infographic. Now it's your turn. Take what we've learned in this particular tutorial and apply it to building your own infographic using your own content. Just promise me you'll keep it simple, just a few elements. Doesn't have to be a photo. It can be other graphic elements as well. Follow the directions that are in the module, but keep it simple. Good luck.